difference to you. Don't waste your time. Here's why. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth.
Thank you so much for the lively introduction. I always come out sort of as that defense is doable, like let's get hyped up about security kind of guy. We've heard about Stuxnet, we've heard about capabilities and attacks on honeypots and doom and gloom kind of scenarios, really good research, really good presentation so far. But I want to really talk about how you do defense. How do you counter a lot of these adversaries in your environment? And I really wanted to focus on two things: asset discovery and network security monitoring. To me, this goes very well with our themes as well. To detect, you have to know how to monitor your environments. To respond, you have to know where to go, where do you actually respond to. And to then control and maintain control in your environments, you must treat security as a process instead of just as an end state. And so those are the things that I really want to cover today. So these are the two agenda items, as I mentioned. A little bit of background about myself. I often find that our pasts help drive what we think of security, sort of our perspectives being unique. My background is working in the US intelligence community, specifically identifying those attacks against critical infrastructure, seeing and monitoring those nation states doing those type of attacks. It's given me a perspective about a lot of the hype we see in the industry. Sometimes false stories sort of bubble up to the industry through news media or vendor marketing. And then now I work a lot with SANS, where I do their incident response training, the co-author of their threat intelligence class as well. So throughout my presentations, I always like to put a little bit of little Bobby in my presentation to sort of bring a focus on that next section. I found that it's very useful to communicate things to wide audiences in very small pictures, easily digestible by everyone. Here we see little Bobby ask Matt, Matt, are all industrial control systems SCADA systems? And Matt replies, no, SCADA is a specific type of control system. We have other things like DCS and PLCs as well. And then little Bobby reminds us that sometimes it's just a little more fun to scream out SCADA. This is what we see a lot when people think of assets in their environments. When we talk about news media, when we see that national policy discussion around control system, a lot of it's about SCADA. But we have a lot more types of infrastructure. We have a lot more types of control systems. And we need to be aware of what those are, how to find them on the network, and how to monitor them so that we can do security over time. Before I really talk about how to find those systems and really what network security monitoring is all about, I want to first talk about the threats that we've seen in the industry. From these threats up on the screen, I put cyber incidents, Stuxnet, the APT1 campaign, BlackEnergy 2, et cetera. And if you go out and ask sort of a general audience of the one that has done the most impact to the community, the most damage in the community, many folks will think Stuxnet, or maybe the latest BlackEnergy 2 or Havex. But realistically, in our environments, Conficker has done more damage in the ICS networks than Russia, US, Iran, China combined could ever dream of doing. Squirrels have taken down more transformers than cyber attacks, right? So we have to always be aware of what threats we actually deal with and how to learn from them and how to understand them to defend against them. Specifically, one of the things that I worked on at SANS with Michael Asante is the ICS cyber kill chain. What we did is took the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain that sort of the IT side of the house uses, and we broke it down into what it means for industrial control system threats. Instead of focusing on these narratives that sometimes form about national level adversaries, this you can't do defense, you can't defend against targeted attacks, they're too advanced, which I think is just hype and fluff. They're very advanced usually because they're tailored to that environment. They're advanced because they're clever. But even with Stuxnet as an example, if you look at Stuxnet and Wireshark, it's very obvious what's going on. It's very obvious that something malicious is on the network. If you take a memory image as an example and look for the piece of malware in digital memory, it's very obvious where it is. A lot of our defenders just need to look at these environments and learn from real threats instead of the threats that we sometimes get hyped up about. So in that first stage of an ICS cyber attack, and when I say attack, I'm talking about high confidence process manipulation. So not what would generally be called espionage, not breaching the network, not finding a device on Shodan and connecting to it, but actually manipulating the process with some level of high confidence. The things and the disaster scenarios that all of us are actually concerned about. When we look at these, that first stage is very similar to what would be on the IT side of the house, the IT kill chain that we've seen from Lockheed Martin. There's the reconnaissance that the adversaries do ahead of time, trying to learn about the environments they're going to target. There's the weaponization or combining some PDF with an exploit and delivering it with a spear phishing email into the business network so you can pivot into the ICS. There's again, the delivery, the exploit, the installation of that capability. It's very similar to what we're all used to dealing with. Any IT security professional can walk you through these models usually. But in an ICS actual attack, when we're talking about, again, that process manipulation, this is just that first stage. And so that was where our research took us to analyzing previous incidents and trying to devise this model, specifically to help extract out information about these threats and what we could learn about them. So when that action takes place down at the bottom, a lot of that action usually is learning those environments. The mythical threat that usually gets championed out is that the NSA, PLA, 8200, FSB, etc. know everything there is to know. They cannot be stopped. They have all of these infinite resources, and they'll always get you. When the truth is, quite a few of those organizations and the threats that you're worried about have no clue about the process in your facility. They still have to go and learn. They have to exploit those systems, do reconnaissance, steal data off the environments to build those capabilities that actually have an impact to that facility. As we all know, you can have a specific vulnerability in a specific type of PLC, but that doesn't mean that you can have a high confidence attack across multiple sectors, across multiple industries. One substation could be configured completely different from another one. You have to learn those environments. So to me, from this first stage, one of the big takeaways is that the attackers are trying very hard to remotely learn your environment, understand the assets, understand the normal baselines, the flows of data, learning those environments to stay stealthy in them and have an impact. That is one thing that attackers have to achieve. They have to get that. And it's one thing defenders should already have. Defenders should know what's on their networks. If it's not normal for your nuclear reactor or your nuclear sort of enrichment facility, rather, to go to myeuropeanfootball.com, you should see that when it occurs, right? You should see these weird things on the network because you should already know what normal looks like in your ICS. When I dealt on an enterprise level SOC where we had ICS and IT environments hooked up together, we were dealing with a magnitude on the government side of around 10 million IP connected devices. It's very hard to tell what China looks like in 10 million IP devices when you don't know what the normal aspects of the network look like. In ICS environments, generally speaking, we're lucky to have far fewer IP connected devices to monitor. A dozen, maybe 100, even for those larger networks, a couple thousand. We're usually not dealing in the millions of IP addresses that those enterprise business departments usually deal with. So again, from that first stage, they're trying to learn about that information. A lot of what we see is just espionage. It's an introduction to a lot of companies that have never dealt with foreign intelligence services and espionage campaigns that are just now seeing that for the first time. That second stage, though, is where that attack actually occurs. And the attackers that we've seen and the threats that we've come across in the community will take the information that they took from that environment, that ICS network, take it back somewhere else to develop a follow-on capability, something that can go and actually do that high confidence process attack. So they usually develop that and they'll have to test it. Think back to the Stuxnet scenario that Kim touched on this morning, looking at the ability to buy the centrifuges or acquire the centrifuges from Libya's program, test out a capability to make sure it worked correctly, and then deliver that capability. It's a very costly scenario for a national level adversary to develop years of research and spend years of money to develop a capability that they haven't really tested out, and then just to let it run wild in an environment and hope it works. When you're talking the millions of dollars in national security issues, nation states like to get those things correct. So we generally see a lot of testing and development around these capabilities. Then there's that second delivery, the installation, and the execution of that attack. To me, this offers a really good opportunity to defenders. There's specifically two I want to talk about. The first of which is time. if we look at learning an ICS remotely to understand the process and not just the flow of IP data, but to really understand the process takes a significant amount of time. So there's a long time that those adversaries are operating in those environments. Going back again to the Stuxnet discussion, we had indications that they were in those environments 2006, 2007 type time frame, 2, 3, 4-year-long campaigns to really learn those environments, develop the capability, and redeliver it. So from a timing aspect, defenders have a great opportunity to take advantage of that to try to identify the adversary. The second really interesting point is usually that redelivering of the capability. There's that second follow-on module, the new stuff coming into your network. That also offers another chance to detect something foreign coming into our networks. Again, it gives a defender an upper hand. So these myths that usually form in the community about defense is super hard and we can never do it and defense isn't doable because the adversaries are just so advanced. We have problems, we have challenges, we have security culture awareness issues. I am not ever going to say that defense is easy. It's very difficult to do correctly, especially over time, with competing priorities. But if we look from a technical discussion, we actually see that defenders have a lot of upper hand. They have a lot of technical advantages that we generally don't take advantage of. Again, we think about asset identification. How many ICS organizations do you know that actually understand exactly what's on their network? Not just the ICS. They usually have great visibility into the ICS itself to identify power outages or process data issues. But if you think from an IP standpoint, the data flows, the top IP addresses they go to, if their internet-connected devices exist on the network, a lot of facilities don't have that information. And there's no shiny box that you can buy from the latest vendor to make up for the fact that you're not doing what you should be doing to take advantage of the inherent technical advantages that an ICS network has. So when I map out those attacks and some of the ones we've seen, what we've done here is on one side, you'll see the ICS kill chain, specifically looking at the different steps that it actually made it through in a given scenario, in this case, Stuxnet. And on the other side, you'll see the Purdue model to discuss where in those architected networks how deep it actually got it to the ICS. With Stuxnet, of course, we saw everything from the external network environments, those Windows-based environments in the business network, down into the supervisory and control data areas, down into actually manipulating process equipment and actually manipulating those centrifuges and the valves on them. So in this case, this was sort of your ideal, unfortunate for Iran, right? Not necessarily ideal for them, but ideal display of that kill chain mapped out. So how hard is it? When we're looking at this discussion of difficulty, it is trivial right now in the ICS community to compromise the security of an ICS, to identify an unauthenticated access into an ICS, to find devices on Shodan, to deliver a spear phishing email, to find ICS that's not connected through any firewall, let alone a DMZ or properly architected network. It's trivial to compromise the security. But to learn about the process, to have that high confidence process manipulation or process attack, to be able to do proper sort of attack with physical destruction, bypassing safety systems, taking advantage of the environment and really understanding it, that's very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult to do. And oftentimes I see a lot of defenders, as well-intentioned as they may be, speaking on behalf of the adversary. How many of you have been on a nation-state level offense team? Anybody? Anybody want to talk about it? Nobody does, right? No hands are going to go up. No one is going to be like, I've been the APT, right? That's usually either extremely classified or there's very few people who do it. Yet a lot of people act as experts on the threat. They'll say, well, a nation state would do this, or a nation state would do that, or it's really easy to run an offensive operation. Turns out, a lot of folks talking about it actually don't have the authority to talk on it. So we see a lot of myths that bubble up in our community, when in reality, there's a lot of opportunities for us to do defense, to take advantage of those things that we're concerned about, comparatively to how difficult they are, and taking advantage of our technical inherent advantages. So to understand your environment and get back to the asset discovery piece, there are a lot of common approaches out there. I note that there's paid tools here, and I'm sort of working at the security vendor aspect as well, but I'm not going to cover those. I just let you know that there are both open source and paid tools available in the communities. What I generally like to see, though, is defenders and network security professionals go through and use those open source tools first. That way they understand the value they're getting out of them. They understand the metrics in terms of time and cost savings, and they can make a business case for security. We generally find that those organizations that can make a business case for security versus just saying, I like security and I want to do more of it, have a longer lasting, mature program in their organization. So I like to see those open source tools levied until you find that you've maxed out their capabilities or you can actually make a business case for buying a new security product. I love my security vendors. There's a lot of cool tools that come out, a lot of great work in the community. But definitely use and understand those open source tools before making those significant investments that ultimately can sometimes be a career-changing move for some of us. I'll also note that on these open source tools, you're going to have another presentation on network security monitoring coming up tomorrow. Chris Sistrunk and Rob have done a really good job of looking at some of these open source tools, so I'm not going to dive too deeply into them. I really want to focus on the security operations aspect of using this information, but they'll do a really good job of deep diving into some of these tools and what value you can get out of them. But I also want to note there's usually a lot of protocols in your network as well that you can grab information from, whether it's ARP, NetBIOS, LLDP, whatever it is. There's general information already in your environments today that you can grab a hold of and learn a lot about your environments without doing any network scanning or anything that could potentially harm the environment. I'm a huge fan of passive analysis, taking network traffic off the environment, taking it away from the ICS, analyzing it, and learning what we can. That way you don't impact the ICS, but you can offer back information that's extremely useful to engineers and operators, as well as those security folks. In this slide as an example, LLDP is that one hop away kind of protocol. As most of you probably know, you can grab a lot of information about that. Here we see a Profinet device sitting in that one hop away that we can discover without ever pinging it or interacting with that device. Wireshark offers some great capabilities as well. It's very useful just to throw a packet capture from network data into Wireshark, go to endpoints and conversations, and determine what's on your environment. Here we see the devices talking to each other. You'll generally find data flows that make sense to you and your ICS. As an example, maybe HMI1 never should talk to HMI2. So we'll see weird activity if they start talking and alert on that. Or maybe we find exactly what devices are using ISO TSAP, DMP3, Modbus TCP, et cetera, to find those control devices in our environments to be able to focus our attention on them initially. So again, it's not easy to map out our environments, but it's definitely doable, and we have the tools and resources to take on that approach. As little Bobby would remind us here down at the bottom, if you can't fix it, at least monitor it. And what I mean by that is you will have legacy equipment. You'll have equipment that you can't patch. You'll have systems that the vendor no longer supports, right? That's okay. We want to get away from that. I'm not saying don't patch. I wouldn't give that advice. But if that is your environment, you can absolutely still monitor it to see when something happens. If you have the vendor sort of backdoor into your environment and they have the default credentials or they have hard-coded credentials that you can't get rid of, that may be okay in your environment, but at least know when they're used. At least be able to develop signatures and an understanding of your environment to know when people are logging into your equipment. So in this next slide, before I get to it, I want to give some preface. Aaron, Colin, and I, so Colin's not here, but Aaron gave the wonderful economics discussion earlier. Aaron, Colin, and I worked on a presentation that was originally Aaron's brainchild, talking about switches get stitches. Basically, identifying vulnerabilities in industrial Ethernet switches to show that there's risk to these devices and that vendors can usually do a better job and configuration and sort of the integrators can usually do a better job of configuring these devices to be more readily secure. In the next slide, without knowing anything about the network, I hope that you can pull out very quickly, again, without knowing any background of the network I've stood up, the protocols, the assets, whatever, you should be able to very quickly pull out where the malicious firmware upgrade took place. Basically, leveraging one of the vulnerabilities, Aaron updated the firmware of an industrial Ethernet switch with his own malicious firmware. And from an adversary's perspective, you own the network at that point, which is awesome, right? From not a good defender's perspective, but from an adversary's perspective, that's great. So can you tell me, without knowing anything about this environment, where the firmware update took place, right? We should be able to very clearly see this giant spike in abnormal data in our environment might represent something that we should look into. So understanding the systems that took place on, understanding the information and context around the date and time, that gives us a lot of opportunity to look into these environments. And again, an adversary might really understand your network by the time they're done, but they might not understand what the network looks like in scheduled downtimes, or what the network looks like in configuration and diagnostic periods, or when contractors come in or vendor support comes in. There's going to be breaks from the baseline that they do in your environments because they're not you. They're not living in that environment on a day-to-day basis. I often find defenders think that the adversary's focus on them is unique. The most important network in that adversary's life is your network because it's the most important to you. Generally, these national level adversaries have a lot of other things going on. Lots of missions, lots of capabilities being developed. It turns out the adversary has PowerPoint too in their environment, right? Briefing management and discussing metrics and making the business case for what they're doing on the offense side. They've got things to tackle which will never allow them to truly understand your environments as well as you should be able to understand them. So when we look at a case study of Havex, this espionage campaign that took place against ICS, most of us are familiar with it from the Crouching Yeti, Dragonfly, Energetic Bear discussion. As an aside, when I teach my threat intelligence folks, I truly sort of preach out to them, please, 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 whatever your internal cover cool name is of these threats, that's fine, I don't care, use it. But when it goes public, let's stick to one. Because right now it's very confusing to keep up with. Well, no, this vendor called it Energetic Yeti, and this vendor called it Dragonfly, and this vendor. It's difficult for folks entering the industry to keep these apart. But the Havex-based malware that was being leveraged against the ICS environments, it ended up targeting and impacting around 2,800 facilities that we know of worldwide, right? So it delivered its capabilities in a number of ways. There was specifically 3 ways that we identified, and by say we, I mean the security community writ large. The phishing emails with the malicious PDFs, sort of standard. Why do the phishing emails take place like this? Because they still work. One more aside, as I'm often noted to do, a lot of us look at those Nigerian email phishing scams, and we always think that we understand the adversary. We sort of make fun of them. Oh, it's so funny that they can't learn English appropriately, like ha ha ha, which it's really hard sometimes, right? And we think about it, but why truly are those emails so poorly written? We found over the years that if you write a really good phishing email, everybody clicks on it. Somebody in your organization is going to click on it. Generally, a large volume of people, if the phishing email is really good, but not everybody's stupid enough to give over their credit card data. But if you write a really gullible email and only really gullible people would click on it, you're probably going to get a higher return on investment to get people to give your credit card data. A lot of the things that we often make fun of adversaries for, they're operating like business units and they understand their own return on investments, right? So continuing on, we saw the watering hole attack as well. We saw where vendor organizations were compromised, copy and paste Metasploit modules. No 0 days, nothing incredibly advanced, just took advantage of what was available. The adversary doesn't get bonus points for looking good in a Kaspersky report. All right, let's think about that for a second. So if you can get away using basic malware, commodity malware, it might not look as really important or sexy to call in the FireEye's, Kaspersky's, Trend Micros, et cetera. So your adversary can generally get away if you find them in the first place. Oh, that's just commodity malware, right? So Havex used copy and pasted Metasploit modules to compromise vendor websites and then infected those users that went to those websites. And that last ability was actually using a Trojanized version of installers to be able to download it directly into the environment. And then there they used and abused the OPC protocol to scan around for information. In these relatively static environments, if you wanted to learn about a lot of facilities around the world, there's not a lot you can take advantage of that's common between a number of industries. OPC was one of those protocols. When I saw Havex, I thought it was extremely clever, and extremely advanced, not for 0 days, which it didn't have, but for understanding their target audience, tailoring that capability for their mission, and to get back data from a large number of sectors around the world. Or let me note 1 second, this IP range on the side, we'll come back to that in a couple slides. But what I've done here is I've infected a small ICS network, lab environment. No ICS was harmed in the making of this presentation. Small ICS environment, I infected it with Havex. If I told you this was the endpoints, the network traffic on that network, it might be very difficult for you to pull off which device is infected with Havex, exactly which devices are being targeted. If you don't know anything about the assets, if you don't know anything about the network, and your first time looking at the network is during incident response, it can be very difficult. But we'll come back to that. When we look at the observable steps in Havex mapped again to that kill chain in the Purdue model, we then see a very set sort of stage 1 type attack. We see that very nicely portrayed information gathering from lots of environments, being able to pull back data. I do not want the takeaway from this slide to be, there's a stage 2 Havex coming. That's, again, not the takeaway. I don't want to sort of hype up anybody. But I would note that if you're developing capabilities, this is exactly the type of information that adversaries want. So when we sit down and we think, oh, they just stole data, or they just stole intellectual property, or they just found project files that were misplaced on the business network instead of the ICS, all of that information is extremely important because it helps those adversaries tailor capabilities later on, and we don't want to give them those options. We want to keep those options away from the adversary to make defense easier for us. So what about network security monitoring? Well, good old little Bobby to the rescue. Network security monitoring, it sounds complex, little Bobby states. And Matt replies back, well, it's just the process of collecting data, alerting on threats, potential threats in that data, and then analyzing those threats to determine that there's really something to be taken consideration of. The focus, he states, is on driving response actions to adversary campaigns. Instead of viewing individual intrusions or phishing emails as disparate events, to understand that adversaries leverage campaigns against targets, and that we need to understand that this is a campaign usually against our organizations. But then, of course, little Bobby states that, well, Matt, sometimes you take the fun out of things. And the point there really is that a lot of the cool, snazzy discussions that a lot of us security folks have, network security monitoring, you should do network security monitoring. A lot of it's kind of trivial to understand. It's very basic. Hey, it turns out you should look at your network and identify what's abnormal. Thank you, security expert, for solving security, right? No, there's a reason we take it back to the basics usually, because a lot of those basics and a lot of the things that we're not actually doing are extremely useful. It turns out the same type of monitoring of your environments to identify misconfigured devices or to identify incidental malware like Configure is exactly the same type of monitoring, exact kind of mindset you need to identify those national level adversaries and those advanced actors. It all blends together. If you can rule out the noise, again, you can generally find these targeted threats. I mentioned, again, earlier, it's hard to find China and 1 million networked IP devices. When we had Bitcoin mining and Configure and Zeus and all sorts of weird activity on our networks, it's very hard to pick through all of that and try to find the advanced actor. But when you actually take care of those security issues along the way, you raise the bar and you take away options of the adversary, and you can truly do defense. So one of the ways that I talk about these things is the sliding scale of cybersecurity. Now, I'll just briefly go through this, but I link at the end these models, and I link the papers as well. I wrote a paper regarding this. Turns out I write more than children's books. Jeff and I write the Little Bobby comic. Every now and then I get somebody come up to me and like, oh, I read your work, and I'm all excited. I'm like, oh, you read my incident response research or any of that? No, I read your children's book. I'm like, oh, yeah, no, that's cool too, man. So with the sliding scale of cybersecurity, it was a paper that I worked on to talk about the investments of resources and basically add nuance to this thing that we call security. Talk about the categories and investments that take place. On one side of the scale, we have architecture, this discussion of actually building, maintaining, securing a network. Not necessarily IT architecture, but everything from the cyber engineering components up to the network, up to patching and maintaining, and building a reliable network, whether it's from targeted attacks or just normal operating conditions. On top of that, a good network will then have its passive defenses, the antivirus, the IPS, the IDS, basically any of those tools that you can walk away from at the end of the day, and you may need to maintain them over time, but if you go to bed at night, they're doing something for you to add to security, right? They're doing some level of security on top of that architecture. That discussion of active defense sometimes gets abused in the media, and I don't have time to really go into a full depth discussion here, so I'll generally sum it up as the two theories. There's one theory, which is mine, that talks about active defense, which relates to military strategy dating back long before the word cyber. And it talks about the ability to identify in your environment things that occur, to respond, or incident response, and then to sort of kick the adversary out. So all about malware analysis, incident response, network security monitoring. As it turns out, it requires empowered, trained defenders to counter those threats. The threat isn't malware, it's an advanced, flexible human on the other side of the world, right? So it takes people to counter people. And the other theory on active defense is just wrong, so we don't have to cover it. All right, so then we talk about intelligence, which is traditional intelligence for the military communities and for the DoD and other sort of acronyms that we throw out there. about collecting data, exploiting it into information, and giving off intelligence. We actually see a huge lack of this in the community because we have cultural and technical barriers to sharing information about incidents. I know personally of a number of incidents, and because of NDAs or classification, I can't talk about them, just like you all probably know of at least a couple and can't talk about them. That puts us in a very bad situation in the community where the adversary can keep learning from their campaigns, but our defense community can't learn from our scenarios. We have to get an understanding of safely, respectfully, and ethically sharing that information so we can grow as a community. And then offense, I include it in there, but I think it's absolutely stupid, to be frank with you. Those folks that want to go back and hack back, we can take it back to the adversary. Great. Get security right first before you try to teach me about how to run an offensive operation. Okay? If you can do all the basic security and all the things on these slides, then we'll talk about national level discussions about going back. But it turns out actually doing security is really relevant to defense. And you don't need any hack back discussion to actually do it. But there are scenarios where national level policies, legal takedowns, Interpol, Europol, et cetera, can do those kind of offensive measures and contribute to security. But what I would position as the return on investment towards security is on the architecture, the passive defense, and eventually empowering those active defenders on top of that. The return on investment for offense is so minimal that there shouldn't be a good business case to actually do it. So when I talk about active defense, one of the models that I teach out at SANS in my ICS 515 class, and one of the models that I truly believe in, is the active cyber defense cycle. Now, I will admit to you, the only reason I threw the word cyber in there is because it makes the acronym ACDC, and I just thought that was clever. So the whole concept of the active cyber defense cycle is taking that information available in the community, that threat intelligence or information sharing, and using those indicators, using that information to drive the process of learning your environment and monitoring for threats. If you know what Havex already looks like, you should be using that information to search for it in your environment. Network security monitoring should then blend over into incident response. That focused incident response should then get samples of the threat. Sometimes it's malware-based, sometimes it's not. But that information they derive about the threat, there's usually teams, whether it be malware analysts or threat analysts, that can pull out information from that and learn and use that to drive back that threat intelligence process. I don't care what model you use in your environments. I like this one. You can use any model you like. But I would position to you that you should have a strategy, and it should be all about being continuous in your process. As long as you have a strategy and you're doing continuous security, good job, right? So if I mentioned again that network that I infected with Havex, if I show you what it looked like pre-Havex, it should be very trivial to then pull out what shouldn't be there. It turns out the network was only using port 502 and then those high-level ports back. So any discussion of 11234 or Ethernet IP for 44818 or ISO TSAT-based protocols for 102, that should be weird. And that should instantly pop up. And again, this is your nation-state level malware that's mythical in nature, right? Scanning out ports on the environment that you should notice don't normally exist in your ICS. From that, you can then take that process, go over and do incident response. What I've done here for the incident response part of the process is I named the malware based off of the MD5 hash so that it was very easy to find. Unfortunately, adversaries don't do this for us. They don't just name Stuxnet after the MD5 hash. It'd be very trivial. But in this example, from just a quick red line snap, what I can find is those processes that were communicating on that port that I didn't expect to see in my ICS. I can very quickly go to my image and go, what process is communicating? Oh, it's this malicious process right here. There's the malware. Not that hard to do when you have that asset identification and you're doing that network security monitoring. Sometimes it will be more complex. There will be issues around these things, but I just want to show you that it can be fairly trivial and very useful. On the threat and environment manipulation aspect, you usually deduplicate information available to you. Don't do all the malware analysis if Kaspersky's already done it as an example, and learn from that. I don't expect there to be reverse engineers and malware analysts at ICS organizations, but every ICS security team can have an automated sandbox. So if you take an automated sandbox, throw Havex into it, you can pull out this barely readable trace DSC, trace dscn.yls file, use that as an indicator of a compromise, and be able to push that out to the community to show when people are getting infected. That threat intelligence aspect, again, moving that to the community, making the business case at the executive level involving those C-suite members. I find as a maturity test, and this is not common, But as a maturity test, if you have a threat intelligence team, the when they're doing correct, is your board of directors members should be able to name the last APT that you went up against. And I know that's a tall order. That's a good maturity test, though. Your C-suite level should understand what real threats that actually pose a risk to your organization are in your industry. And then everyone down from that at that tactical level should be able to use information in the environment, information in the community to drive that security threat hunting. So the last case I'll get through here in just a couple minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, was BlackEnergy 2. iSight Partners and Trend Micro Analysts did a fantastic job of identifying this threat. Basically, iSight came out and said, here's a bunch of C2 or command and control IP addresses. Here's this sandworm zero-day exploit. It's pretty cool. And then Trend Micro Analysts said, that's weird. We have a simplicity file, specifically this config.back file, beaconing out to one of those C2 addresses, but it's SCADA targeted. So they posted a blog saying, yeah, GE's simplicity system is getting targeted with this exploit. And then that caused iSight to go back in the data and go, oh, it turns out we've got this configuration file for semantic servers as well. And so they use indicators bouncing off each other and data sets they already had to identify this new threat. If we go back to that AC/DC model of threat to network security monitoring to incident response to evaluation, we can then quickly go through this scenario. From a threat intelligence consumption aspect, you can find those indicators from the iSight report and go into your environment and hunt for that. Find those C2 addresses, those weird IP addresses that shouldn't exist in your network, and realize, oh, my HMI is infected. I've got something beaconing out to this domain. That's weird. I should go take a look at it. So from those indicators, we can see the NTP protocol was being used to check to see if the C2 server was reachable. They weren't using DNS or anything that we generally log for. They were using the network time protocol to be able to go out and say, is the C2 active or am I in a sandbox? From there, you can then look to the device that's being infected. In this case, it was an HMI. Pulling off that data, you can then identify those new IP addresses that you otherwise wouldn't have seen. Not the indicator that you had, but now this 46 range IP address. Oh, look, this is new command and control server I didn't previously know about. And if I take a sample of a threat and submit it to something like VirusTotal or understand the threat since it's already public anyways, it looks like it's BlackEnergy. And Kaspersky and these other folks have reports that I can now ingest. That, again, can lead us into the incident response, into the threat environment and manipulation piece, where those incident responders go collect the data, they learn more about it, and from there they can find the file names, the executables, the different processes that end up running on that infected system. From there, you get a really good understanding of the threat. You get a really good understanding of what it's doing on your system, and you might identify that if you have a scenario where you have two threats, like many folks in the ICS community this past year actually did. Havex and BlackEnergy both came out around the same time. And when the ICS CERT was trying to determine if they should respond to Havex cases or BlackEnergy cases, they found a data deletion aspect to BlackEnergy 2 through analyzing its capabilities, which helped them prioritize focusing on the BlackEnergy response. So by understanding the threat, they help prioritize their own efforts and pass out indicators of compromise or scripts to be able to scan out in the environment and look for these threats. And they identified multiple members of the community that were infected that they previously didn't know about. From there, again, that threat and environment manipulation to that threat intelligence consumption aspect, you can take that data and start finding those executables, files, pieces of malware, the variants that you didn't previously know about. Going from that single IP address indicator down to understanding that there's also that Siemens file that's being manipulated, going down to find out that there's this basic Windows executable that was also going to other folks. Again, getting a really good threat picture to analyze the real threat and not just what we hear about in the news stories. As an example, if I mentioned to you the BTC pipeline in 2008, a lot of you will think back to the article that came out saying that there was a cyber attack on BTC pipeline. It didn't exist. Did not happen. There was no cyber attack on that facility. A lot of national media coverage. I work with think tanks in DC. I'm a fellow at New America, dealing with them, talking with national policymakers who believe that attack occurred. The Russians were not responsible despite best intentions, right? So if we have a nation state, in this case Turkey, comes out and says, it was extremists, and the extremists come out and say, yep, it was us, it's ridiculous for someone else to go, no, they're all wrong, it was cyber and it was Russia. So when we actually dig into that story, we find out that it wasn't true, and a lot of folks believe that hyping up the threats to be something they're not will engage the community, right? It'll have folks go through and make changes in their environment. But unfortunately, then resources get allocated to a made-up threat versus the real threats we can learn from. So as I end out, the BlackEnergy 3 case study, BlackEnergy 2 and 3, we can identify it along the same way, where even though it was a potential scary kind of piece of malware, it was still that stage 1 kind of access. And we can learn a lot from engaging it and learn a lot about our environments to go monitor in our environments and use that asset identification and that security process to really secure our ICS. So with that, little Bobby reminds us, have traditional security measures failed? Matt says, well, most people don't actually do traditional security. So when something fails, they blame what they didn't do. And then little Bobby reminds us that, well, maybe not doing security is traditional security. So I'd position to you all that we have the resources we need to actually make defense doable. And we have a lot of strengths in the community that we can take advantage of. Sometimes it takes little more than a single motivated person at a facility using readily available tools to really make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to admire your bit rate.
Yeah, I'm a very fast talker indeed, yeah. So thank you for the patience.
Oh, that's fine. Oh, so there's a lot of questions popping up in my head. You're talking about people who are, now I will become a little bit cynic, warning. You're talking about people who have a mindset of doing a job that is not only doing a job, but extend the expectations of doing a job because they will look for things that doesn't look right. And, you know, in my opinion and from my experience, those people are as rare as unicorns.
Yep.
Sorry to say, but...
Oh, absolutely.
So how do we change that? How will we make people more curious?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I always note is we generally all have some level of expertise in something. You don't have to be a hashtag thought leader on Twitter to be good at something, right? So you have some level of expertise that there's new folks in your environment that want to do something. There's new people coming in that got involved in security or your environments for a reason. And if we put out in the community all the hype and we talk about all the threats and cyber war and, oh, it's never doable, OMG cyber, sorry, defense sucks, we shouldn't be surprised when these new folks come in and go, well, never mind, I'll just take my paycheck and go home. But when we leave security conferences, we're all familiar with that high that comes after a security conference. I want to go change the world. And about 2 weeks into it, and every 9 o'clock morning briefing that you have, you're like, never mind, right? So I would say take that high that you normally get, find where you get it from, whether it's teaching, whether it's engaging people in the security, whether it's security conferences, whatever it is, find it, and then influence your sphere. Not everyone's going to be changing national policy. Not everyone's going to be identifying the next APT. But you have a sphere of influence to go change the lives of those folks around you. And ultimately, you can make and empower those people that have that interest. But you're right, it's rare. That interest is brief. If you sort of misabuse that interest of those new folks, don't expect them to stick around and be what you want them to be.
Yeah, and it has to pay back more than your usual paycheck, maybe. So how many of you have a sort of bug bounty program in your organization? You know what I'm talking about, yeah? One? Good, for you.
You're special, yeah, all right.
Because that is, in a sense, a way to attract people to find good things. And, you know, the secret, it's much cheaper than having a consultant doing the same job.
Yeah.
Because I have the experience of gathering a number of sysops, developers, users in our company for one night, and we had a nice dinner, and we had a sort of capture the flag challenge, and they were so excited about this. They said, oh, this is so fun to be able to spend so much time just trying to find difficulties. I never have the time during the day work. Yeah. So I think
find what motivates your people. Whatever it might be. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's not. Find what motivates your people and take advantage of that, for sure.
So I can tell from these questions from the audience that this has been a long day.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends writing in very troll questions, I'm sure.
But that data analysis offline means storing, sanitizing, sharing versions of it with experts. What's the best way of doing this?
So luckily I can punt this question to the presentation that's coming up about network security monitoring by Chris and Rob. They talk about the ability to take off data and store it. In an enterprise environment, to store 30 days of packet capture is insane. It would be very expensive to try to do that. A couple terabyte hard drives can store a lot of ICS data. So there's an ability to take off that data and secure it, but realize it's valuable data to the adversary. You can't just have a database that's addressable online that you can go access into without authentication. You still have to secure. It turns out you still have to do security. But taking off that data and maintaining it's very useful. If folks did nothing more for my incident response scenarios than go through their environments, take a tool like Redline that's freely available, and go baseline their environments once a year and store it off on a read-only CD in a vault, when incident response takes place, that would save me and save them probably 70% of my billing hours. That baseline to work off of is a significant advantage to those incident responders.
That's interesting, yeah. So maybe we should go and have a look at this ballot.
All right. What was the question?
Yeah, I can read it out for you. Yeah. So apologies for my back. Have you implemented NSM for ICS? Oh, that is a lot of acronyms. Nice. I love that.
Yeah.
And 10% says yes, we have. Monitoring in place, 14%, yes, we have integrated ICS, NSM, and Office IT NSM. 24, we have a project.
That's pretty exciting to see so many people doing it. What I would say is it's definitely catching on. It's sort of easy to do from a security standpoint of investment, right? There's a lot of free tools is what I mean. They're free, but they still cost man hours. But we're definitely seeing the community get better in this way. So I generally have about 1,000 or so security professionals that I train throughout the year via SANS. I teach about 18 weeks out of the year now. And we've seen huge changes in this. So I honestly feel that the industry is getting better. It's easier to be a cynic, but it's not appropriate in the industry.
Yeah, of course. And of course, I cannot resist asking the question: how big of a threat is the squirrels?
Oh, the squirrels, they're everywhere. So there's a really good Twitter exchange for those of you that are interested. There's a cyber squirrel Twitter that documents all of the outages related to rodents in the United States. There's a significant number. Like if China, US, Russia, Iran, whoever your APT type of threats had that success ratio, we'd be in a different world. Like the squirrels are quite powerful, it seems. Yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, thank you very much, Robert.
All right, thanks.